I stood at the front door of the red-bricked house in Manchester, suitcase in hand. Rain pattered softly against the windows, the grey afternoon light casting long shadows across the hallway floor. Behind me, the wind whispered like it was urging me to go. Inside, chaos simmered. I could hear Irene sobbing, loud, aching cries that seemed to tear through the walls themselves. She lay crumpled on the living room settee, her thin hands gripping a cushion to her chest. Just across the room, Douglas, my brother-in-law, stood shaking with fury. His cheeks were flushed, his voice cracking as he pointed a trembling finger at my husband, Philip. "Are you honestly just going to stand there and say nothing, Philip? Mum's in bits and you let her carer go without so much as a plan. What exactly do you expect now? For her to make her own dinner? And Eliza," he swung his glare towards me, "you're just walking out the door with your bags, not even a word." Philip stood stiff as a garden statue, silent, unmoving. The man I once knew, who used to speak up, used to care, had become cold and impenetrable. I laughed, but there was no joy in it. Just weariness. Whoever fired the carer should be the one looking after her. I've done enough. I've been the invisible helper for over 20 years in this house. I think I've earned the right to rest. Douglas turned towards me, eyes like razors. "You've been living in this house. Eating our food. Enjoying the comfort. And now you think you can just waltz out when things get hard? Is that what family means to you?" My grip on the suitcase tightened. My knuckles whitened. The audacity, Douglas. After all these years, what exactly do I owe you? If it weren't for Philip, I would have left long ago. Irene gasped, clinging to her chest, her cries rising higher. How did it come to this? I've become a burden now. After all I gave, this is what remains of me. The room felt thick with history, heavy with unsaid things. I looked around once more. The ivy plant in the corner drooped from thirst, like it had given up too. The mug of tea on the table still steamed, untouched. My reflection in the mirror was tired, but resolute. I turned back to the hallway, 1 foot already across the threshold. "I hope you all manage." "Good luck," I said, not turning back. Then I walked out into the rain. The train rattled along the tracks as I stared out the window, watching fields blur into towns, and towns into countryside again. My suitcase rested beside me, and for the first time in years, I could hear my own thoughts. I remembered the early days, when I first moved into Philip's family home. Irene had been colder than the stone floors, always reminding me I was not one of them. Her comments were never loud, but they cut deep. "We like things done a certain way here, Eliza," she would say with a smile that never reached her eyes. Back then, I had believed love meant patience. I scrubbed that house, cooked every meal, and sat beside her hospital bed after her second surgery. Yet somehow, it was never enough. Douglas never lifted a finger. Even Philip had long ago stopped defending me. 20 years. 20 years of pouring myself into a family that saw me as staff in disguise. There were no holidays, no breaks, just the quiet ticking of the house as I moved through it like a ghost. Irene would sigh when I walked into the room, and Douglas only noticed me when he needed something. Philip used to be different. He had laughed with me, traveled with me, brought flowers for no reason. But slowly, as the years wore him down, he changed. The weight of his family's expectations crushed the parts of him I had loved most. Until all that was left was someone who avoided conflict and forgot I had a voice of my own. I wasn't angry. Not really. The anger had faded long ago, replaced by something far heavier, exhaustion. Bone-deep exhaustion. The train slowed as it entered a small station outside the town of Shrewsbury. I wasn't sure where I was headed, but anywhere was better than going back. I had booked a small room in a guest house for the week. Just enough time to breathe. To think. To feel like a person again. As I stepped off the train, the breeze caught my scarf and I laughed, a small, strange sound I hadn't made in months. I tugged the suitcase along the cobbled platform, the weight of it nothing compared to the one I had left behind in that house. At the guest house, an elderly woman greeted me at the door. Her voice was warm and her eyes kinder than anything I had seen in that house for years. "Welcome, love. You look like you've come a long way." I smiled and stepped inside. Back in Manchester, the silence in the house had grown heavier. Without Eliza's quiet footsteps, without the rhythmic clatter of pots and pans or the soft murmur of her voice reading aloud to Irene, the house had begun to feel abandoned. Philip sat alone at the dining table, a half-eaten sandwich untouched on his plate. The ivy in the corner was drooping even more now. Dust was beginning to settle where once there was constant motion. For a man who had spent years avoiding decisions, the silence now was deafening. Douglas stormed in and out, barking at phone calls and sending aggressive texts. He tried to arrange another carer, but none of them lasted more than a day. Irene refused to speak most of the time. When she did, her words were fractured and filled with resentment. She knew every corner of this house, Irene muttered to no one in particular. Every pill, every ache. And now I have strangers touching my arm, like I'm some forgotten relic. At night, Irene cried louder. Philip would sit at the edge of the bed and stare at the wall. She had never needed to say it aloud before, Eliza was the glue. Without her, everything cracked. Meanwhile, in the guest house in Shrewsbury, Eliza sat by the window with a warm cup of tea. She wrote in a small leather notebook she hadn't touched in years. Each page held a truth she hadn't dared to speak while she was still in that house. "I was never their daughter-in-law," she wrote. "I was the unpaid caretaker, the peacekeeper, the invisible help. But I let them make me that way. I stayed silent for too long." She paused, watching the autumn leaves fall from the trees beyond the window. A family walked past, their dog tugging at the lead, laughter echoing in the distance. There was a strange ache in her chest, something between regret and relief. The elderly woman who ran the guest house, Mrs. Alden, knocked gently on the door. "I've made a little stew, love, if you're hungry. You mustn't go to bed on tea alone." Eliza smiled. "That sounds perfect, thank you." As she followed Mrs. Alden downstairs, the warmth of the small home wrapped around her like a blanket. It wasn't grand. It wasn't spotless. But it was peaceful. Later that evening, she sat by the fire with a blanket around her shoulders. She didn't know what came next. But for once, she didn't feel she had to decide for anyone else. No one was watching, no one was waiting. And in that stillness, something in her began to mend. The wind howled down the narrow streets of Shrewsbury as Eliza returned from a quiet walk by the river. The sun had set early, and the air bit at her cheeks, but she felt lighter than she had in years. She had picked up a small loaf of bread and some apples from the village shop, her steps steady, her breath unhurried. But as she reached the guest house, something shifted. There was a sleek black car parked just outside the gate. It wasn't local. Mrs. Alden met her at the door with a tight smile, her eyes flicking toward the parlor. "You've got visitors, love." Eliza's stomach turned. She stepped into the hallway and immediately saw them, Philip and Douglas, sitting side by side, coats still on, expressions drawn. "Eliza," Philip began, rising halfway before pausing awkwardly. We came to talk." "I didn't invite you," she said quietly. Douglas snorted. "Clearly. But you ran off, and Mum's barely functioning. We thought we deserved at least a conversation." Eliza remained by the doorway. "You thought you deserved it?" Philip raised a hand. "Please. Just hear us out. We realize now what we've done. We didn't see how much you held together until you left." Douglas muttered, "She's a wreck, Eliza. Mum. She keeps asking for you. Refuses everyone else. Refused to eat for a day. Eliza kept her arms folded. She asked for me when she wanted the tea just right. When she needed her pain medicine at precisely 9:30. But not when I cried in the laundry room. Not when I had migraines from the stress. Where were you then? Neither man answered. Their silence rang louder than words. I am not your emergency exit, she continued. You can't treat someone like furniture and then notice the missing piece only when the room falls apart. Philip looked away. Douglas's jaw clenched. Eliza softened her voice, but it didn't waver. You need to understand that I didn't leave to punish anyone. I left because I was no longer living. I was existing. Quietly fading in the corners of your lives. Mrs. Alden appeared discreetly in the doorway, holding a tray of tea. Shall I leave this? She whispered. Eliza nodded. Yes, please. Just for me. The men sat awkwardly as Mrs. Alden placed the tray beside Eliza, who took her seat by the fire, her back straight, her eyes clear. I suggest you return to Manchester, she said calmly. You've said your piece. I've heard it. Philip looked like he wanted to say more, but he only nodded. Douglas stood, his voice low. If you ever decide to come back. I won't, Eliza said gently. I'm not yours to return to. They left without another word. The door clicked shut behind them. And in the fire's glow, Eliza poured herself a cup of tea, added just enough milk, and breathed. A week passed. Then another. The sky turned colder, and frost began to gather along the windows each morning. Shrewsbury shifted into winter's hush, and Eliza found a rhythm she hadn't known she needed. Every day, she walked to the market square. She bought fresh bread, read a book by the river, and returned in time to help Mrs. Alden set the table. They didn't speak much, but the silence between them was kind. It was the kind of silence that let her breathe. One evening, Mrs. Alden tapped gently on Eliza's door with a folded sheet of paper in hand. I wasn't going to mention it, she said, but there's a small cottage nearby. Just became available. Belonged to my sister, bless her. Wouldn't cost much, and it's only a short walk from here. Eliza stared at the paper. A tiny photograph showed an ivy-covered stone cottage with pale blue shutters and a garden gate. Something in her chest fluttered. You don't have to decide now, said Mrs. Alden softly. I just thought, you deserve somewhere of your own. That night, Eliza didn't sleep. She watched the moonlight spill across the floorboards and tried to remember the last time she had chosen something just for herself. Not for Irene. Not for Philip. Not for the family. By morning, the frost clung thick to the trees. She wrapped herself in her coat and walked with Mrs. Alden to the end of a narrow lane. And there it stood, the cottage. The garden was overgrown, but the roses had survived the autumn. The door creaked open, and inside, dust danced in the light from the window. The fireplace was cold, but sturdy. The kitchen held just enough space for one. She touched the wall with her fingers, half expecting it to pull away from her. But it didn't. It held her. 2 days later, she signed the papers. The first thing she bought was a small kettle. Then a thick woolen throw for the armchair. She lit a fire that evening, wrapped herself up, and let her body sink into the warmth. There were no calls from Manchester. No more knocks on the door. The silence wasn't lonely, it was hers. And for the first time in nearly 3 decades, Eliza looked around and saw something that was hers, completely and entirely. Her own space. Her own breath. Her own beginning. Winter deepened. The days grew shorter, the nights longer, but inside the cottage, a different kind of warmth settled. Eliza found herself humming while she tidied the shelves, laughing quietly at her own jokes, lingering over her morning tea. She had not realized just how hollow her days had become until they were finally filled with nothing but peace. One afternoon, while sorting through the old oak drawers in the bedroom, she came across a faded envelope. It was yellowed at the edges and brittle with time. The handwriting on the front was slanted and unfamiliar. It simply read, "To the next woman who calls this place home." Curiosity pulled her into the small armchair by the fireplace. She opened the envelope with care and unfolded the single page inside. "Dear you. If you're reading this, then you've chosen this cottage, just like I did. Maybe you've come here for rest, or peace, or something else you can't yet name. Whatever the reason, know this, you are allowed to be here. You are allowed to take up space. You are allowed to rest. You are allowed to begin again. This cottage saved me. Perhaps it will do the same for you." Eliza stared at the words, her fingers trembling slightly. There it was, written proof that she wasn't alone in her need to escape. Someone else had stood in this room, breathed this air, and found something sacred in the stillness. She folded the letter again, this time more gently, and placed it back where she found it. But something had shifted. The words stayed with her, echoing with every step she took across the creaking floorboards. That evening, she sat at the tiny writing desk near the window and picked up her own notebook. "I no longer dream of returning," she wrote. "I don't ache to be forgiven. I don't wait for recognition. What I long for now is smaller, quieter. A life where I matter to myself first." Later, she tucked the notebook away in the drawer beside the stranger's letter. Two stories, resting side by side. Proof that beginnings don't always require fanfare. Sometimes, they come wrapped in silence and shelter. Outside, the frost had softened, and the wind no longer howled. It whispered. Eliza rose before the sun. The cottage was still and blue with early morning shadows. She moved quietly through the rooms, lighting a small fire and placing the kettle on to boil. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old books. She dressed in a warm jumper and corduroy trousers, pulled on her boots, and stepped outside. The path was dusted with frost, but the sky above was clear. The old garden was waking slowly, buds had begun to form along the hedgerows, and birdsong echoed gently between the trees. She walked into town, not for anything in particular, but because she could. Her footsteps made soft sounds on the cobbled lane, and the scent of baking bread drifted from the bakery. At the florist, she paused and bought a small bundle of daffodils, bright and defiant against the grey. Later, she returned to the cottage and placed the flowers in an old jar on the windowsill. They looked like sunshine trapped in glass. She stood there for a while, just watching. For the first time in years, Eliza no longer needed to perform. She no longer needed to prove her worth through laundry or caregiving, through silent sacrifices or polite nods. There were no hidden expectations in this house, no unspoken rules about where to stand or how to speak. She could cry if she wanted. Laugh if she pleased. Make toast at midnight, or let the dishes sit. No one would raise an eyebrow. No one would comment. It was a life made of small freedoms, but they were hers. Mrs. Alden visited that afternoon, carrying a tin of homemade biscuits. "I was just thinking of you," Eliza smiled as she opened the door. Mrs. Alden winked. "I thought you might need something sweet with your tea." They sat in the kitchen, the fire crackling behind them, a comfortable hush between words. When Mrs. Alden left, Eliza walked her to the gate and watched her disappear down the path. There was something beautiful about watching someone leave without dread. It wasn't abandonment. It was simply life moving, gently, without force. As evening fell, Eliza sat again by the fire. The flowers still glowed by the window, and the fire popped softly in the grate. She held her notebook, but didn't write. She didn't need to. Everything she felt now lived quietly in the air around her. And for once, nothing was being asked of her. A light rain tapped gently on the cottage roof. Eliza stood barefoot in the kitchen, a bowl of lemons beside her, the kettle gently whistling on the stove. It had been exactly 1 month since she'd arrived in Shrewsbury, though time felt different now, softer, kinder. She sliced the lemons slowly, their scent bright and clean, and dropped them into a pot for tea. No clock rushed her. No voice hurried her along. Outside, the trees swayed gently. The roses by the gate were blooming again. And within her, something that had once felt knotted and tight was loosening. She sat by the fire, knees tucked beneath her, her hands wrapped around the warm mug. On the table beside her rested a parcel wrapped in brown paper, books from the local shop, a candle, a scarf she had knitted herself. Gifts. But not for anyone else. For herself. Eliza no longer marked her worth by how useful she was to others. She no longer measured love in chores completed or sacrifices made. She had learned to sit with stillness, to accept joy without suspicion, to exist without apology. Once, she would have flinched at solitude. Now, she understood it. There were no apologies left to give. No doors left to knock on. She did not need her absence to be noticed or her silence to be interpreted. In the drawer beside her notebook, the stranger's letter still rested. You are allowed to begin again. The words had been true the first time she read them, and they were true now. Because Eliza had not just begun again. She had reclaimed the parts of herself that had gone quiet for too long. That evening, as dusk settled over the hills, she stepped outside into the garden. The wind tugged gently at her cardigan, but she didn't move. She watched the sky melt into pinks and grays, and breathed in the scent of damp earth and open space. No one knew she stood there. No one needed to. And yet, for the first time in decades, she felt entirely seen.